Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is a plant growing series on growing giant Bangkok guava from cuttings, day 0. I just bought this plant from a local nursery. I live in San Diego. My name is Melvin Way, by the way. Search for my name on YouTube or Google at any time to find my channel, my videos. So this is a rather large cutting. It's almost an entire branch, but the twig at the bottom isn't that thick. So I haven't seen a picture or video on how big these trees get. I assume they can get fairly big because, as the name implies, they produce giant guavas, not those tiny ones that they use to make juice in a lot of American supermarkets. Growing up in Taiwan, I had a lot of these and other cultivars and species available in Asia. I remember the fruits as being rather large and remarkably good tasting, although they do have a certain texture. I don't remember if they were sort of dry at the center of the fruit. I don't really remember because I haven't had one for ages, but they would have guava juice produced by this species in restaurants, and it was as commonplace as ordering Coca-Cola, etc. So you can see there are buds growing all over this, and there are nodes that are very obvious. There's bark. This was perhaps taken from the end of a well-developed tree's branch. So I think these nodes won't really do anything unless you cut off all the other foliage, then they will activate. But the bark sort of has a reddish brown sheen to it, and as you can see here, it looks like that was cut and wrapped with parafilm or soft plastic wrap to produce some kind of I don't know, grafting or something like that. So I'm not quite sure what went on there. And as you can see, the bark gets rougher as you go down, and there's still some new foliage coming out. The leaves at the top have been bitten and sort of eaten by something, and as you can see here, there's a lot of dead leaves. So this comes in a very thin, cheap plastic pot. This is obviously potting mix of some kind, akin to what you would buy in Home Depot or Lowe's or Target or Walmart or any of those stores. So on day 1, I decided to do what I did with a lot of other plants, which is to bestow systemic resistance to parasites using dissolved imidacloprid. Bugs are always a huge problem. I don't have a watering tray here, so it's just leaking out, and it's leaking luckily in my favor off the glass, off the top layer and onto the bottom layer. I had some seeds in there and I watered and watered, but nothing came out. So I have a lot of things ongoing at the moment. That's not always true, but I'll try to get in the habit of producing more regular content in terms of new series, not just episodes, for 2019. So I still have quite a few things in the pipeline. So as you can see by day 22, the leaves are more red. I think some of the leaves, if you go back in the footage earlier in this video, were already like that. I assume that's some kind of disease. I did read that these can grow as evergreens here in Southern California. So I think these are diseased. They've obviously been fed on by some kind of animal. If not something like a rabbit, then maybe large bugs, locusts, beetles, or whatnot. I don't know what eats these giant Bangkok trees here in San Diego. And some of the leaves are falling off, and there's webbing. I think the webbing is perhaps from spiders, not spider mites. If they were from spider mites, I would have noticed all these little spider mites crawling over everything. They're really disgusting little ancient parasites that plague a lot of plants that are grown in potting mix. So I got this from a nursery that specializes in selling exotic fruit trees and other trees and ornamentals and flowers even. And don't assume that just because you bought it from some place that supposedly does everything organic and right, that you're going to get a plant that's perfectly healthy, because these pots were just sitting under the canopy of much larger trees, and they were sitting in cold, rainy, cramped conditions with not much sunlight. I don't know what the winters are like in Thailand, but I can't imagine that They're comparable to the winters in San Diego, especially since the winter of 2019 was very, very cold. So it's day 44. There's just so much material to cover up. Previously, at the end of the last clip, I was showering to try to get some of that filth off of the leaves because it looks like everything's diseased and infested. So I can't really see any signs of bugs here. There are some little plants growing. That happens a lot, and I don't think these can get much bigger than that because they're competing. So there is a lot of new foliage coming out. The stems and leaves, when they're new especially, are very attractive. The foliage has a very upright angle to it. It's not droopy. The leaves have plenty of structure, and the petioles and the stems directly below are this blushing pinkish red. It's very beautiful, and it looks like all of the leaves here are going to be replaced. And that's weird because if I read correctly that these can function as evergreen trees in San Diego, then why are the leaves being replaced? To me, it seems obvious that there's some kind of disease or infestation going on that's not very apparent, but that's what's causing all of the original leaves to be lost, because if you go back to the beginning of this video, they did seem more or less fully green, even though most of them were eaten. And now they're turning redder and redder and brittle and just dirtier. So it might be some form of mite. Not too sure at this point. Many of my plant growing series have been plagued by mites over the last few years. So as you can see, at least we're getting new growth, although we are losing a lot of leaves at this pace. So it'll take a while, but I imagine that all of these old leaves will be replaced by beautiful new ones, perhaps even larger ones, and we'll see where we go from there. The imidacloprid I poured in, the dissolved imidacloprid from Bayer, that should have given this plant systemic resistance since many weeks ago. If it's day 44, then it definitely should have taken effect. That means any parasites, invisible or visible, that are trying to feed on the leaves and stems and drink the fluids of the plant will get poisoned basically, and they'll fall down. And I should see evidence of thousands or at least hundreds of like tiny little insect parasite corpses. Some of them aren't even insects, but they're arthropods of some kind, and they're just not insects. So for the most part, the new leaves look healthy. That one on the left looks like it may have been a little spotty. So it's day 57. It's been another, 13 days. And as you can see, the top leaves are red. It's almost like it's losing all of its foliage in autumn, if this were the kind of climate where that happens. But in most of San Diego, typically, especially in the lowlands, things can be evergreen if they can or desire around the year. So this pot is kind of, the soil mass is kind of low in there. I could add more soil directly on top or sand, but I think for now this has a lot of soil mass relative to the size of the cutting. And on day 64, you can see I'm finally filming this in natural light. The days are getting longer. I started this in January 2019, and by now I think as of this episode it must be March, probably still early March. And as you can see, there's foliage pushing up against the old stuff, which looks pretty crusty now, but the videography looks a lot better under bright natural sunlight like this. So I think there might be some kind of infestation, and that's what's causing all the leaf loss, and that's what's causing the leaves to look very crusty. So I think around some point I did add another dose of dissolved imidacloprid. I split one dissolved container like the one you saw earlier among several different plants typically. So maybe it just didn't get a heavy enough dose, or the infestation was really bad. Imidacloprid is the world's most widely used insecticide, so hopefully It does a little more than things like pyrethrins and pyrethrin analogs. So on day 70, instead of just talking endlessly like I did in the other series about getting a watering tray yet not going out to buy them, I finally got one, which means I won't make a huge mess every time I water. So as you can see, the little plants down there in the pot are not really going anywhere. So I think this has enough soil mass. At some point, if I see a lot of growth throughout the rest of 2019, I could transplant this into a bigger pot, but I don't really think in most of my plant growing series that the pot size and soil mass was the limiting factor, though I do have another plant growing series coming out that has enough data to suggest to me that it's the depth of the soil that matters a lot more than how wide your pot is. So shallow pots are pretty much a waste. So if you had a pot that was maybe 3 inches deep and 3 feet wide, it pretty much wouldn't do anything for a lot of species except those that enjoy really hot and dry climates with infrequent rain, perhaps. But even those typically can have very deep tap roots, such as the Joshua tree seedling that I'm growing. I wouldn't call it a sapling yet. So as you can see, the water that's running out is pretty clear. Sometimes, I think for some of the other pots, the water that runs out is all brown looking, and it can be nasty, depending on what is dissolving out of the soil. So on day 88, as you can see, I'm filming at nighttime again, and there's a stark contrast between lush foliage coming out that's not quite that big yet, and all these much larger leaves that are sort of drooping and look all crusty and diseased. So hopefully this transition goes a little faster. 88 days to see only this kind of growth from such a tall cutting is quite underwhelming. I know it's San Diego, and San Diego has experienced an uncharacteristically cold 2019 winter, and perhaps that's just too much for this cutting, but it's been 88 days. That's almost 3 months. So this thing is struggling quite a bit despite the help I gave it with insecticide. Maybe it doesn't like potting mix, because for all the things that I'm growing from seeds in 2019, I'm sort of using a blend of store-bought sand and California clay dirt or clay soil that I'm just finding in the hills in the neighborhood, and that seems to have been working really well, actually. And I have various blends of the mixture I just mentioned, such as in the beginning I was doing things like maybe 85%, 80% sand, only 15-20% wild hill dirt, but at the same time I felt like the root systems would lack a little bit of structure and the stems would lack in support. So things would tend to shift around in that kind of a mix. So right now I'm favoring more of a 50-50 equal volume mix, although even though when you mix those things together the volume decreases because sand particles are larger with larger spaces and the silt can fit in between those, so you need to add more material. So anyway, it's day 107. Those little weeds are about the same size. I haven't been watering that diligently because it's been winter and it's been cold and rainy for most of 2019 up until this point, so I just felt like I didn't need to water that much. So you can see there's finally a bit of respectable new foliage coming in. It's beautiful. And let's see, more dead leaves that I'll remove. And I just can't wait for this plant to get a makeover eventually, but I don't know how long it's going to take. You can see to the left there's sort of 2 strands or more of spider web. There's some more spider web there. I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that all of this decaying plant matter all the old leaves are attracting a lot of bugs, or they were just parasitized by bugs. There's also a possibility that could just be spider mites right there. A lot of those tiny little beige dots. So spider mites are sort of like spiders and sort of like mites, but they're neither really. They're an ancient pest, and they spin their own silk threads to protect themselves from predators, but they can pierce the individual cells of a plant, the cell walls, and just drink the cytoplasm straight out like a juice box. Yeah, looking at the underside of that leaf to the left, it kind of looks like maybe it has some spider mites. So maybe that was a problem all along, and maybe some more time and more doses of imidacloprid should solve that. But I'm not quite sure if imidacloprid is 100% effective against those. On my Joshua tree, it seems like the scale insects, despite applying imidacloprid over periods of maybe weeks or months, it doesn't seem to have killed them off entirely. So the foliage up here is looking pretty good, and now that I have a watering tray, I can water more liberally and even let some water collect in that tray. This is a very small pot, and the potting mix is very loose. It doesn't hold on to water well. The moment you water, it just runs straight through. So I have to water maybe twice a week. I think that's what the instructions suggested for most of my cuttings in 2019. So it's day 122. There's still yet more dead foliage down there, and these little sprouts that aren't really doing anything, and we can see process of regrowth is gradually overtaking all the death and decay going on with the old foliage. So there's been a fair bit of progress. The plant sort of looks half aesthetic and half unaesthetic at the same time. But as you can see, the new leaves are getting big. They're finally becoming impressive. I think after a while, maybe by early summer, this will be a very good looking plant and hopefully free of pests. But so for most of my years running this YouTube channel, I was buying the occasional pyrethrin sprays or pyrethrin analog sprays, and those would kill a wave of bugs at first, but they'd all come back within 2 or 3 weeks. Imidacloprid seems to have more lasting effects and is safer for foliage, because when you spray foliage this thin with anything other than very pure water, you'll burn the leaves. So you can see there's a lot of webbing there. It's quite unsightly. It's obviously a problem, and I hope it gets dealt with. In the meantime, I'll apply more imidacloprid and hope that that gives the plant enough systemic resistance to poison all the parasites that are trying to feed on it. So here's another dose of imidacloprid, which I'm going to split among several plants. So wish me luck, and stay tuned to my YouTube channel for a second episode. Thanks for watching.